was there for me to feed and pet and water, and on the farm for strictly my entertainment. I named him Petey, and he would gobble, gobble, gobble every time he saw me. And now, it was the day before Thanksgiving, and my grandma and my grandpa were talking in hushed whispers in the kitchen. And I heard my grandma say, "Bill, it's time to take care of you-know-who, so I can get him dressed for Thanksgiving." But I walked into the kitchen, pigtails and all, and I asked in wide-eyed wonder, "Get who dressed?" And you could hear a pin drop, and the air became thick with tension. And I could feel it, but I couldn't understand why. And old Grandpa kind of shoveled with his feet back and forth, and his eyes were down, and he had his hands deep in his pockets. And Grandma shushed him out of the house, and she told me to stay with her, as Grandpa had something that he had to tend to. But when Grandma wasn't looking, I snuck out of the old back porch, squeaky floor and all, and I carefully began to search like a detective that I was for my grandpa. It was the oddest thing ever. As from the old barn, I could hear a funny sound like metal scraping. And when I went inside, there was my grandpa, and he was sharpening the great big axe. And I swallowed hard, and I said, "Grandpa, what you gonna do with that?" And he looked up, and he seemed to peer deep inside my eyes. And then suddenly all grew silent. And then he slowly wiped the blade of the axe with an old rag from his pocket. And then he hung it up on the wall on a nail. And then he said, "Go feed Petey. Why, I tell you, Grandma, we gotta go into town." "Yay," I hollered, as I knew something special was up. And suddenly, all the tension that I had felt just a fleeting moment ago began to melt away. As we tiptoed past the house and to the gravel driveway, I can still hear the crunching of the pebbles beneath our feet. The Grandma sang out, "Bill, did you take care of that matter like I asked you to do?" And Grandpa said half out loud and half in a whisper, "Oh, Annie, hold on to your panty girdle. Barbara and I have something very special to do." Then Grandma got the drift, and she said, "Now, Bill, don't you go buying Barbara any candy now. We don't want any holes in her teeth." And he said back, "Don't worry, Annie, I won't." But he was winking at me with one eye and smiling with the other, all at the same time. Now, there were days that he would give me a ride on the back of his red motor scooter. And on those days, he would hand-walk that scooter all the way to the corner so Grandma couldn't hear the engine. Because she had a fit when he gave me a ride, because she was afraid I'd get hurt or something. But not on this day. This day, we walked hand in hand. And I can still remember how my tiny hand would get lost in his strong but gentle grasp. And we walked to the store together. And I can still feel that warm sun as it flashed on our face and our hair and our clothing. And we passed many houses and trees. And finally, we entered the town. And we walked into the old general store. The store's owner was named Pop, and he wore a brown leather apron. His hair was snow white, and the steel-framed spectacles shone, and they were perched on the end of his nose. He glanced over at us, and he said, "Howdy. Now what can I do for you fine folks today?" And I began to gaze around the large store. Everything you can imagine was there, from thimbles to thread, to material to canned goods, to vegetables, some canned and some fresh, detergents and meats. And in the window was a bunch of turkeys, and they were hanging upside down by their feet. And they were naked. There was not one feather among any of them. And as I stood there gazing, thinking in my young mind that they must be freezing, my attention was suddenly averted, because I could hear my grandpa say to old Pops, owner of this old store, "Show us your best treats." And I could still hear our footsteps echoing across the brown wooden floor. And I can feel the ceiling fan's cool breeze whirling slowly and making their mournful sound. And there was always a special odor in this building, but a pleasant one. And all the canned goods were lined up on the shelves, things like canned tomatoes and peaches and much, much more. And there was also a scale on the counter. And as I ran toward the display case, which was made of glass, I pressed my nose against it, and it was cool to the touch. And I looked on in wide-eyed wonder. And inside was candy corn, licorice beads, jelly beans, peanut brittle, juju breeds. And on top of the counter was peppermint sticks. And on the counter to the right was a very large jar of jawbreakers. And then my grandpa, he broke that tension of the moment, and he said, "Hey, little lady, why don't we start the day off at the ice cream counter?" No, I knew this was going to be hard work, but somebody had to volunteer, so I raised my hand eagerly, and I began to squeal in delight once again, and I clapped my hands, and I jumped up and down with great anticipation. Then old Pop said, "Go ahead and have a seat while I find my white hat and my white apron." I quickly scurried to the iron chair that sat high next to the old wooden counter, and I began to spin around and around and around, and the room went around and around and around. And then my eyes caught the silver milkshake maker, and under the silver lids were all kinds of colored syrups, boysenberry and butterscotch and strawberry and pineapple and chocolate, and there were fresh bananas in a bowl and cherries and crushed nuts, and every flavor under the sun of ice cream that you can imagine for this 5-year-old to choose from. And I looked at my grandpa, and he looked at me, and then he looked at old Pop, and he said, "Let's shoot the works. 2 banana split specials with extra chocolate and whipped cream on the top, and 2 maraschino cherries, and hold the nuts." And I said with a grin, "Yum, yum." And I can still remember my grandpa to this day, sitting right next to me, and my small legs and feet, how they dangled on those old ice cream stools, and not a word was exchanged while we downed those 2 splits, except for an occasional yum, yum that echoed within the old walls of the general store. Then soon the last mouthful disappeared, and all you could hear was the clinking of our spoons as we were scraping the bottom of our glass dishes. Then we both sat back and breathed a contented sigh, and we patted our full bellies. Then slowly and leisurely we pushed ourselves away from the counter, and I thanked my grandpa eagerly. And he said, "How about something for the road?" And I agreed heartily. And I began to skip back to that candy counter, and my eyes scanned the lollipops and the rock candy. But what caught my eye was that large glass container with the large jawbreakers. And my grandpa knew instinctively just what I wanted, and he said, "Pops, make that too." And I thanked him, and we both popped those large red jawbreakers in our mouths, both at the same time. And then Grandpa said to Pop, "By the way, you see Petey's cousin up there, Mabel, the biggest and the fattest turkey up there in that line? Wrap her up." And as I looked at my grandpa, a warmth began to pour through me. And then he said, "Now, we don't have to mention what we just ate to your grandma now, do we? As we wouldn't want to upset her." And I agreed wholeheartedly. And then my grandpa slung old Petey over his shoulder with one hand. He took my hand in the other, and we quietly walked back to the farm, hand in hand, sucking on our jawbreakers all the way home. And I gave thanks in my young heart that old Petey got to see and live many, many days. And for this, I am indeed truly grateful. This is Barbara Clouser. And now, my dearest ones, it seems I've run out of time. Please take very good care of yourselves. Have the best Thanksgiving ever. And remember, I love you. And I will always love you. And I'm just one phone call away.